Did you know that in 1943, a US Navy ship allegedly vanished into thin air, right before the eyes of its own crew? That it disappeared from existence and returned seconds later, leaving behind horror, madness, and a mystery that the government has denied for nearly a century. This is the story of the Philadelphia experiment, one of the most haunting legends of the Second World War. But as we peel back the layers, you'll begin to wonder, was it really just a legend? The year was 1943. The world was at war. Nazi Germany controlled Europe. Japan dominated the Pacific, and in the dark, cold waters of the Atlantic, German submarines known as U-boats were silently hunting American supply convoys. Thousands of tons of cargo were lost every month. The Allies were bleeding ships and men at an unbearable rate. The US Navy faced an impossible challenge. How do you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you protect your fleets when death lurks beneath the waves, unseen until it's too late? That question gave birth to an idea. What if, instead of detecting the enemy first, you could make yourself impossible to detect, invisible, unseen by radar, sonar, or even the human eye? Rumors began to spread through naval intelligence circles, whispers of a classified project in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, a project that could change the course of the war. It was said to involve some of the brightest scientific minds in America, and a theory so radical that few dared to believe it could work. That theory was called the unified field theory, a concept first proposed by Albert Einstein himself. In simple terms, it sought to connect two great forces of nature, electromagnetism and gravity. If mastered, it could, at least in theory, bend light, distort magnetic fields, and even manipulate space itself. To most, it sounded like science fiction. But to the desperate minds of wartime America, it sounded like a possible miracle. The vessel chosen for the experiment was the USS Eldridge, a newly built destroyer escort, sleek, fast, and armed to the teeth. But when it arrived in Philadelphia, something about it was different. The shipyard was fenced off. Guards stood on every corner. Entire sections were restricted, even to high-ranking officers. Witnesses described seeing thick cables snaking across the decks, connected to enormous Tesla coils and magnetic generators the size of rooms. Scientists moved like ghosts in white coats, scribbling on clipboards, arguing in low voices. Electricians worked through the night, wrapping the Eldridge in a web of copper and steel. Locals began calling it the invisible ship. Some claimed to have seen Einstein himself visiting the base, though no record of such a visit exists. Others swore that Nikola Tesla's earlier experiments in magnetism had been secretly revived for military use. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: something extraordinary was about to happen. By late October, the experiment was ready. The date was October 28, 1943. A cold morning, fog rolled in from the Delaware River as engineers and officers took their positions. The ship's engines were idle. The crew, dozens of men, stood at their stations, unaware that they were about to witness something that defied all known science. Orders were given, switches were flipped, and deep inside the Eldridge, massive coils began to spin. The hum was deafening. Witnesses described the air vibrating, like the world itself was being torn apart. Blue sparks leapt across the deck. The smell of ozone filled the air. Then slowly, a green mist began to rise around the hull. At first it looked like steam, but it shimmered like light itself was bending around the metal. Sailors watching from the docks felt the hairs on their arms stand up. Compasses spun wildly. Radios crackled and died. And then silence. The USS Eldridge began to blur. Its outline shimmered, distorted, like a mirage. Within seconds, it was gone. Gone. No radar signal, no trace on sonar, no reflection on the water, just emptiness. Those who witnessed it would later say they could still feel something where the ship had been, a faint vibration, a low-frequency hum that resonated in their bones. Then, just as suddenly as it vanished, a brilliant blue flash ripped across the sky. The Eldridge was back, but what returned was not the same. The ship's metal hull glowed faintly, smoke poured from its vents, and on the deck, chaos erupted. Men stumbled and screamed, disoriented, vomiting, collapsing where they stood. The officers on shore rushed to assist, thinking perhaps the experiment had simply overloaded the systems. But when they boarded the Eldridge, they froze. What they saw defied logic and nature. Some crew members were missing entirely. Others were unconscious, twitching, bleeding from their ears, and a few were fused to the metal of the ship itself. One man's legs were embedded halfway into the deck, his torso still breathing. Another's arm disappeared into a bulkhead, solid steel. Two sailors were found locked together, their bodies melted into one. Those who survived were incoherent. They spoke of falling through darkness, of seeing the stars below them, of hearing voices whispering from the walls. One screamed that he had seen the edge of time. The medical officers could only watch in horror. No one could explain it. No one dared to try. The experiment was immediately classified. Witnesses were threatened, transferred, or declared insane. Within days, all official documentation vanished from naval archives. The USS Eldridge was quietly reassigned to routine escort missions, far from Philadelphia. But those who had seen it disappear never forgot that day, the green fog, the blue flash, and the unholy silence that followed. In the months that came, whispers of the event spread through the Navy like wildfire, a story too impossible to believe, yet too vivid to forget. Men who served aboard the Eldridge were rumored to suffer strange symptoms, blackouts, amnesia, spontaneous burns. Some claimed that objects would pass through their hands, or that they'd vanish for moments at a time. Others were never seen again, and as the years passed, the question remained, what really happened on that October morning? Was it a failed experiment in invisibility, or something far more dangerous? Did the USS Eldridge disappear from sight, or from reality itself? When the USS Eldridge reappeared, the men watching from the nearby dock expected to cheer. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, proof that science could bend reality itself. But the moment the green mist cleared, the cheering stopped. The ship was there, yes, but what came back was wrong. The air shimmered around the vessel like a mirage. Metal seemed to groan, as if the ship itself were alive and in pain. A sickly smell of ozone and burning oil filled the air. Then came the screams. Sailors staggered across the deck, vomiting, eyes wide in terror. Their skin was blistered, covered in strange burns that glowed faintly under the sun. Some couldn't speak, just trembled, staring at something only they could see. And then someone shouted, "God help us, he's in the wall." Crewmen ran toward the voice, only to find one of their own fused into the steel hull, half of his body still visible, the rest swallowed by the metal. His face was frozen in silent agony. Another man's hand was fused to a bulkhead. He was still alive when they found him, screaming for someone to cut him loose. Others were gone entirely. No blood, no trace, just missing. Those who remained said that for several minutes during the experiment, the world itself disappeared. There was no sky, no sea, no sound, only a glowing fog that surrounded them like a living thing. Some said they floated, weightless. Others said they saw stars moving sideways, bending like liquid light. Then came the pressure, like every bone in their body being crushed at once. And then darkness. When they opened their eyes, they were back aboard the Eldridge. But time felt wrong. Clocks had stopped, compasses spun wildly, and some of the crew, those who survived, were never the same again. Days later, strange symptoms began. Men waking up in the middle of the night, screaming that they were falling through the floor. Others vanished right before their bunkmates' eyes, only to reappear moments later, disoriented, begging to be tied down so they wouldn't drift away again. Reports began reaching command. The Navy quickly moved in. Files were seized. Witnesses were isolated. Families were told their loved ones had died in a training accident. But in bars along the Philadelphia waterfront, sailors whispered the same phrase again and again, Project Rainbow, a secret attempt to bend light, magnetism, and gravity itself to render a ship invisible. But something had gone horribly wrong. Instead of hiding from radar, the Eldridge may have slipped into another reality. Years later, survivors spoke anonymously. One sailor, calling himself Carlos Miguel Allende, claimed he jumped overboard during the experiment and woke up hundreds of miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. He said he'd seen his fellow crewmates frozen in time and that some never came back. Investigators dismissed his story as fantasy until he revealed Navy coordinates and classified serial numbers that matched the Eldridge's actual records. When journalists tried to find him again, he was gone. No address, no family, no record of enlistment. It was as if he had vanished too. Meanwhile, the Eldridge itself was quietly reassigned, its logs sealed, its name changed, its history erased. Officially, the U.S. Navy denied everything. They called it a myth, a sailor's tall tale, but in the decades that followed, strange sightings continued. Fishermen swore they saw a glowing ship appear off the coast, just for seconds, before fading into thin air. Electronic equipment malfunctioned whenever the name Eldridge was mentioned in certain naval archives, and those who investigated too deeply often met with sudden silence. Voz abaixo, Tom Conspiratorio. Some physicists suggested it wasn't invisibility at all, but a side effect of manipulating electromagnetic fields so powerful they tore a hole in space-time itself. If true, it meant the Eldridge hadn't disappeared. It had slipped into another dimension, taking human lives with it. Others claimed it was mass hallucination, caused by radiation or magnetic interference. But if it was just an illusion, how do you explain men fused into steel? How do you explain the missing logs, or the sailors who spoke of voices in the fog? Whatever happened that day, one thing is certain: the Navy buried the truth deeper than any wreck at sea, and those who were there carried the horror with them for the rest of their lives, haunted not just by what they saw, but by what they became. Because when you tamper with the boundaries of reality, sometimes reality fights back. Fade out Compsons de radar, ondas e memórias distantes. On every secret has its architects. And behind the horror of the Philadelphia experiment were men who believed they could rewrite the laws of the universe. When the United States entered World War II, it wasn't just a battle of armies, it was a war of intellect. From Manhattan to Los Alamos, physicists were racing to weaponize science. But while Oppenheimer and his team were splitting atoms, another group was exploring something far stranger: the manipulation of space and light itself. It began with a theoretical framework: Einstein's unfinished unified field theory, a daring idea that all forces in nature, gravity, electromagnetism, space and time, could be woven together under one formula. If mastered, it could unlock the ability to bend space, and perhaps reality. In 1942, Navy scientists at the Office of Naval Research reportedly approached Einstein for consultation. Though there's no official record of his full involvement, witnesses recall the physicist attending meetings at Princeton, discussing the implications of large-scale electromagnetic fields. His warning was simple: the results of tampering with time and space could be catastrophic. But in war, caution is often the first casualty. Soon, classified teams began assembling under what would be codenamed Project Rainbow, a division so secret that even its own engineers were not told what they were truly building. Among them was Dr. Franklin Reno, a physicist obsessed with invisibility and magnetic refraction. He theorized that if you could create a powerful enough magnetic field, you could bend light around an object, just as gravity bends light around a star. Reno's equation suggested something extraordinary. If a field reached a certain frequency, it might not only bend light, but distort time itself. Máquina elétrica ganhando força, pulsos baixos de energia. The Navy saw opportunity, not danger. If a destroyer could disappear from radar or from sight entirely, it could patrol enemy waters undetected. It could strike without warning. It could end the war. So under orders from high command, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard became the site of the most secret experiment in modern history. Dozens of coils were installed. Cables thicker than a man's arm ran across the deck. Sailors were told it was degassing, a harmless magnetic treatment to prevent mines from detonating, but the officers knew otherwise, and so did a small group of scientists working under extreme secrecy, people who years later would vanish from the public record. Voz abaixo, Tensa. Dr. James Jessup, a naval researcher, vanished in 1944 after claiming he had seen proof that a vessel moved through dimensions. His car was found on a rural road outside Maryland, the engine still running, the driver's seat empty. In the decades that followed, files related to Jessup, Reno, and others involved were redacted, pages blacked out almost entirely, Freedom of Information requests returned fragments, field unification, displacement anomaly, containment failure. No one outside the Navy ever saw the full reports, yet behind closed doors, whispers persisted. In 1955, a package was delivered to a UFO researcher named Morris K. Jessup, no relation. Inside were annotated copies of his own book, marked with handwritten notes claiming insider knowledge about the Philadelphia experiment. The writer called himself Carlos Allende. He described how the Eldridge was made invisible by generating an electromagnetic vortex strong enough to twist space-time and teleport the ship from Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia. He even drew diagrams of the field generators, with equations referencing Einstein's theory. But the strangest part wasn't what Allende wrote, it was what he seemed to know, technical data that had never been made public, coordinates matching Navy archives, and references to crew reassimilation problems, a chilling term suggesting the fusion of men and metal wasn't an accident, but a known side effect. Just Pop turned the materials over to the Navy. Months later, he was found dead in his car, with a hose leading from the exhaust. The verdict, suicide, but there were no signs of depression, and he had just told colleagues he was close to uncovering proof. Coincidence or cleanup? Many believe Project Rainbow didn't end with the Eldridge. Some reports suggest the research was relocated to Montauk, New York, a facility later tied to experiments on human consciousness and time travel. Others claim fragments of Einstein's field calculations resurfaced under the early programs that birthed the US stealth technology decades later. If that's true, then the Philadelphia experiment was not a failure. It was a beginning, the dawn of a new understanding of how matter, energy, and time intertwine, a secret humanity wasn't ready for. But it came at a cost. For every discovery, there was a disappearance. For every formula, a name erased. And for every whisper of success, a trail of bodies left behind. In the official archives, Project Rainbow does not exist. The Eldridge's logs were rewritten. The scientists' notes destroyed, yet the physics remain, too complex to be invented by rumor, too precise to be coincidence. So who were these men, visionaries chasing a future beyond imagination, or fools who tore open a hole in the fabric of creation? Perhaps both, because if Einstein was right, and everything, space, time, energy, is one field, then tampering with one force could ripple across them all. A single miscalculation could turn invisibility into catastrophe. And that's exactly what may have happened on that October morning in 1943, when man reached out to grasp the invisible and found instead the edge of eternity. Every story of discovery has two sides: what the world is told and what must be buried. When the Eldridge reappeared in Philadelphia harbor, panic rippled through the chain of command. Those who saw it spoke of men screaming, of bodies half fused to bulkheads, of eyes that stared without blinking. But within hours, the Navy sealed the dock. Guards were posted. Cameras were confiscated. A new narrative was born. Nothing happened here. Inside a dimly lit room at the Office of Naval Research, senior officers gathered around a stack of classified reports. Witness statements were burned, medical logs rewritten. By the next morning, the ship had been quietly relocated to Norfolk, Virginia, and the surviving crew transferred to separate bases. Vosbycha Controlada. Each sailor signed an oath of silence under threat of court-martial. Some were told the experiment had been a routine test of magnetic shielding. Others were told they had imagined everything. But memory is a dangerous thing. A few months later, strange incidents began to surface. Sailors from the Eldridge were reported in bars, trembling, claiming they could feel the ship moving through them. One man collapsed mid-conversation, screaming that he was slipping out of phase. Another vanished from a diner in Norfolk, right in front of witnesses. When newspapers tried to investigate, Navy spokesmen denied the ship had ever been in Philadelphia that year. But archived transport records told a different story. On October 27, 1943, one day before the alleged test, the Eldridge's engines were logged as inactive due to special equipment maintenance. After that, all documentation was replaced with typed copies, dates subtly altered. To the public, the case was closed before it even began. To the sailors, it became a nightmare they could never speak of. Several were committed to psychiatric hospitals within months. One doctor's notes, later leaked, described patients who react violently to magnetic fields and report temporal disorientation consistent with dissociative fugue. But when journalists requested access to these files under the Freedom of Information Act, they no longer existed, and yet the whispers wouldn't die. In 1956, a merchant seaman named Carlos Allende sent a series of letters to researcher Morris K. Jessup. In them, he claimed to have witnessed the entire experiment from the deck of another ship. His description matched what survivors had said in secret for years: the green fog, the silent flash, the return. He warned Jessup that men died for touching forces mankind was never meant to know. Jessup was fascinated and terrified. He began connecting threads between the Navy's electromagnetic experiments, Einstein's lost equations, and emerging Cold War research into radar invisibility. Then, in 1959, Jessup was found dead in his car, engine running, hose from the exhaust. Police called it suicide. But investigators noticed something strange. His briefcase was gone. Inside it, he had told friends, were the notes proving that the Navy had lied. After Jessup's death, the Philadelphia experiment became more than a rumor. It became forbidden knowledge. the Navy issued its first official statement, declaring the story pure fiction, but researchers noticed the denial was curiously specific. They didn't say the Eldridge had never been tested, only that no experiment of this nature was ever officially sanctioned. Officially, behind the curtain, funding quietly flowed into private laboratories through shell organizations like the Brookhaven Institute and the Montauk Air Base Project. In those hidden facilities, scientists continued experimenting with electromagnetic resonance, brainwave manipulation, and time-space field disruption. Decades later, whistleblowers would claim that Project Rainbow had evolved into Project Montauk, a program designed to study psychological warfare, remote viewing, and yes, temporal displacement. Vozganie rytmu narrativu do filmy. If true, it meant the Philadelphia experiment was never shut down, it simply changed its name. Meanwhile, the Eldridge itself disappeared from history in a more literal sense, decommissioned, sold to the Greek Navy, renamed HS Leon. But the sailors who served aboard it spoke of whispers through the hull, of instruments that flickered at random, of compasses that spun uncontrollably whenever they passed the engine room. Some refused to sleep below deck, saying they could feel the hum of another world vibrating beneath their feet. By the 1970s, conspiracy researchers began piecing together the pattern: suppressed files, missing crewmen, scientists who vanished without trace. Each clue pointed to one conclusion: the US government had unlocked something it couldn't control and spent decades trying to bury it. Vos firmi, som de datilografia antiga ao fundo. Internal memos leaked in 1984 confirmed limited Navy experiments with electromagnetic camouflage in the 1940s. Though none admitted to time distortion, one chilling phrase appeared repeatedly: human factor unstable. Was that bureaucratic code for men fused to steel, or for minds fractured by glimpses of another dimension? Either way, the cost of secrecy was enormous. Families of the missing were told their sons had died in routine service accidents. Death certificates were unsigned, bodies never returned, and every time someone tried to reopen the investigation, another file went missing. Today, skeptics argue that the entire story was a Cold War myth, born from paranoia and fear. But even skeptics cannot explain the coincidences, the missing pages, the sealed archives, the witnesses who describe the same impossible details decades apart, because sometimes a lie leaves an echo, and in those echoes you can still hear the pulse of generators, the hum of coils awakening, the crackle of energy tearing through air, as if the experiment never truly ended. Maybe it didn't. Some theorists believe that every time a massive electromagnetic test is conducted today, somewhere in a lab or a military base, a faint disturbance echoes back to that moment in 1943, a resonance between 2 points in time, as if the Eldridge is still out there, drifting between worlds. Officially, the government says there was no project, no experiment, no cover-up, but when light bends and space trembles, truth itself can disappear. Fos final soleni. In the end, maybe the real conspiracy isn't about what vanished that day, but about what remained: the silence, the fear, and the certainty that somewhere, hidden behind layers of classified ink, lies a truth too dangerous to be spoken aloud.
Did you know that some say the Philadelphia experiment never truly ended? That even after 1943, the USS Eldridge continued to haunt the seas it once patrolled? Decades after the alleged experiment, sailors began to report strange incidents: glowing shapes seen at night in the Atlantic, ghostly ships vanishing into fog, and radio interference that carried whispers in old military codes. Some claimed that every few years, radar operators caught a brief impossible blip, an object moving faster than any known vessel, before disappearing. Others insisted they had intercepted distress signals signed DE-17-3, USS Eldridge. The government, of course, denied everything. They said the ship never vanished, that no such experiment ever took place. But when journalists tried to access the original ship logs, pages were missing, dates didn't match. The Eldridge's movements in October 1943 remained strangely inconsistent: 2 locations at once. The official explanation: administrative errors. But to many, it felt like the cover-up of something much bigger. By the 1960s, the story had grown into legend. Carlos Allende's letters resurfaced, his warnings to scientists, his claims that he'd seen the Eldridge vanish. And though skeptics dismissed him as delusional, his descriptions matched earlier classified reports almost too precisely. He knew details no civilian could have known. Some researchers believed the Navy accidentally opened a window, a rift in space-time, that the ship was not merely invisible, but momentarily displaced, thrown out of our dimension, and then violently pulled back. Witnesses described crewmen embedded in the deck, others fused into steel bulkheads, as if the ship had swallowed them alive. It sounds like fiction, but if that kind of field distortion were real, it could explain everything: teleportation, disorientation, even the sailors' insanity. And yet others take the story further. They claim the experiment's success led to new programs, Project Rainbow, Montauk, even early tests in teleportation and mind control. Hidden beneath the Cold War's veil, scientists allegedly continued what began in Philadelphia, perfecting the manipulation of time and consciousness itself. If that's true, the Eldridge wasn't an accident. It was the first step into a new kind of warfare, one fought not on land or sea, but through reality itself. But maybe the truth is simpler. Maybe it was all rumor, a sailor's tale gone too far, a misunderstanding of classified technology, mixed with fear, war, and human imagination. Yet the question remains, why did the Navy erase records? Why did witnesses vanish? Why do sailors, to this day, claim to have seen the Eldridge appear for seconds on moonless nights, glowing faint green before dissolving back into the dark? Perhaps the Philadelphia experiment isn't about invisibility at all. Perhaps it's about humanity's obsession with breaking boundaries, our relentless urge to touch the impossible, and in doing so, we sometimes tear holes in things we don't understand. Today, the USS Eldridge no longer exists, at least not officially. Its hull was sold to another navy, renamed, stripped of its secrets. But stories persist of strange magnetic readings, of compasses spinning wildly when near its final port. No one knows what really happened that October morning in 1943. But if you ever find yourself alone at sea and the fog turns green, listen closely, because somewhere, out there, a ship may still be trying to come home.